In offering this paper, I'm taking a slightly different route into issues of literacy to other people. This is not so much a presentation on the results of a historical inquiry about the literacy of New Testament audiences. Instead, it focuses on the New Testament text itself and addresses a couple of questions that relate to the literacy of the New Testament audience. Firstly, to what extent do the New Testament writers expect that their audiences are literate, whatever that means? Secondly, given that there are many texts which could be known to the readers of the New Testament, not least the Scriptures of Israel, how do New Testament readers interpret the text, the New Testament text, against these textual backgrounds? In order to do this, this paper will make use of relevance theory, a linguistic theory originally described by Sperber and Wilson throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, culminating in their most significant book, which is mentioned on the footnotes of the handout. And this is a theory which offers a comprehensive description of human communication. And as such, it can be helpful in showing how humans process communication, and therefore it's useful in addressing the two questions that begin this paper. While much of the theory has been used to describe spoken utterances, it's also been applied to the more complex and sophisticated sphere of written texts and literary works. Despite having less communicative immediacy than spoken communication, there is nothing about texts in themselves that signals that they should be interpreted in a different manner to spoken utterances. And relevance theory has also been applied to biblical studies with considerable benefit since about the early 2000s with Stephen Pattamore's monograph on relevance theory as applied to the book of Revelation. But before that, there have been quite a few people that have been applying it to principles of biblical translation. But despite this, relevance theory should not be seen as a method to interpret texts. What it does is give a theoretical underpinning to describe how textual communication proceeds. So it doesn't necessarily give different results to other methods that are used to interpret the text, because if relevance theory describes the universal processes that humans subconsciously use in interpreting texts, then other scholars are probably utilizing relevance theory even though they don't know it when they're working on texts themselves. However, relevance theory does highlight a couple of aspects of the communicative process, and it shows how readers interpret text in the way that they do, and that makes it valuable. So we need to spend a bit of time thinking about relevance theory and what it is. Communication might seem to be some form of code system, where the thoughts of the speaker are coded into words which are subsequently decoded by the hearer. But relevance theory regards communication as both more complex and more elegant than this. Language is a form of code, yes, but codes are only part of communication. Like other pragmatic theories, relevance theory notes that communication relies upon inference, on hearers inferring the meaning of what is spoken. But it goes further than this and states that communication is focused around relevance. A statement is relevant if what it implies, together with what's explicit in the content of the text, gives the reader some new information. In other words, it is relevant if it modifies the context or cognitive environment of the reader to give new cognitive effects. Such cognitive effects might include new knowledge, confirmation or denial of something that was originally thought by the hearer. And relevance is a balance between these cognitive effects and the processing effort that is required to obtain them from the utterance. Something is more maximally relevant if it has more cognitive effects for less processing effort. Hence the two definitions that you have on the handout, the extent condition 1. An assumption is relevant to an individual to the extent that the positive cognitive effects achieved when it is optimally processed are large. So does it give a lot of cognitive effects? Second one, an assumption is relevant to an individual to the extent that the effort required to achieve these positive cognitive effects is small. How much effort does it cost you to process the utterance? So such contextual effects are developed unconsciously by inference through an interaction of the utterance with the hearer's own context. This context is typically the hearer's physical surroundings, the content of the discourse so far, or what is called encyclopedic information available to the hearer. In texts, the previous material in the text and the encyclopedic context are usually all that is involved, therefore. Encyclopedic information is especially important for the purposes of the discussion here. It's much like your discussion about bookish circles, that it incorporates that. It's a collection or a cluster of information that surrounds the topic under consideration in the person's mind. So therefore it can include things like personal opinions, personal assumptions that the reader has, socially conditioned opinions such as social norms or stereotypes, memories of past events, including those things that are held in social memory, and various imagery and retained data within the person's mind. They're going to be highly individualistic with any particular person. It's possible that it can also contain some more affective and emotional content too. How this information is accessed is critical to relevance theory. The reader's goal is not simply to attain as many cognitive effects as possible. Readers do not assume that every utterance that they hear will give them maximal relevance. Communication is based on optimal relevance. As such, when somebody hears an utterance, they begin to search through their available contexts, looking for where the utterance is relevant to them. Once they've obtained sufficient contextual effects to satisfy their expectations of relevance, they stop searching. No more context will be accessed. No more contextual effects will be obtained, however interesting they may be. Because optimal relevance is dependent upon minimal effort, a reader begins the search for relevance in the contexts that are most available to them. If there are several different ways to understand an utterance, they will interpret it according to the most accessible interpretation. In this way, the reader is able to assign reference to specific aspects of the utterance and to disambiguate things that are confusing. So a reader can trust that this is how communication works, because communication is, in relevance theory terms, ostensive. That means that the speaker that's giving the utterance seeks to make it as relevant to the hearer as they possibly can within the limits of their ability. As such, the speaker is aware of which interpretive contexts are most likely to be accessible to the hearer, and ensures that the most accessible context is the one that will yield the conclusion that they wish the hearer to obtain. If it isn't, they will provide signals in the text or extra information to ensure that the hearer makes the correct inference. So the burden of achieving relevance lies with the speaker. There's more to this theory, obviously, than this very brief sketch, and there are three things that I'd just like to mention as we go through and discuss them. First one is the difference between implicature and explicature. We're not going to lean too much on this as in the rest of the paper, but I think it's helpful to make the distinction. Relevance theorists often talk about there being a difference between an explicature of an utterance and an implicature of an utterance. Explicatures are the assumptions that arise explicitly from the utterance itself. In other words, what is plainly stated and explicit in the statement. Everything else are implicatures, and they are inferred from the utterance. And so, therefore, implicatures are important. For example, in things like indirect answers to questions. If someone asked, "Would you like a hamburger?" and somebody replies, "I'm a vegetarian," then the answer no is not explicit in their reply. It's an implicature derived from the explicature of the utterance, that they're a vegetarian, and certain contextual information, that hamburgers contain meat. In giving this answer, they clearly intend the hearer to reach the answer no, in order for the original question to be answered. Such an indirect answer requires that their hearer expend more processing effort in analyzing it than the straightforward answer would. But in return, the hearer can expect some more contextual effects in terms of implicature. These can range in strength from certain strong ones that the speaker clearly intended to convey. Things like they wouldn't eat a steak, for example, to other weaker ones, perhaps that they're a bit irritated that you'd forgotten that they were a vegetarian, and to still weaker ones that are associated with any stereotypes that may arise in the mind of the person hearing it, what they think a vegetarian would normally do and be like. Such implicatures therefore fall on a spectrum from strong to weak. The stronger they are, the more likely they are to form part of the communicative intention of this person speaking. The weaker they are, the more responsibility that the hearer must take for forming those implicatures from the utterance. Second thing I want to mention is meta-representation or representation. Writers sometimes report what other people have said in their writing, and at times they do this explicitly and signal that they're doing it, and that they're quoting. For example, in English we use quotation marks, and in the Greek New Testament there are various introductory formulae that are used to introduce, as it says in the prophet Isaiah, for example. And doing this explicitly signals that they are quoting somebody else's work. At other times, writers can do it more loosely. In relevant terms, this is identified as a representation of the thoughts of the other writer. In communicating these thoughts or words, writers give both the thoughts of the other person and their own thoughts about them. Sometimes they approve of them, sometimes they disapprove of them, sometimes they mock them. At other times, these representations sometimes writers can communicate a representation of a representation. In other words, attributing certain thoughts to somebody else. Not just saying what the person has said, but saying what they think the person was thinking in order to make them say something. So you can get this chain of representations that go on within a text. And it's important that they are identified. It's important to identify such representations because they do not necessarily give the opinion of the author about something. Instead, they give the opinion of others that the author wishes to critique in some way. Thirdly, ad hoc concepts. Relevance theorists sometimes talk about ad hoc concepts in addition to talking about contextual effects. Certain concepts that develop around a thought as you're analyzing a text or working with a text, certain concepts that develop around a discourse can develop as the discourse goes on and as the narration continues. These concepts can shift and morph in the mind. Theorists refer to these as ad hoc concepts, a temporary construction developed by the reader around a concept to assist in understanding it, whether that's a word, a concept, or a metaphor. These concepts are continually revised as the discourse continues. And the cluster of information that's gathered around a word or around a phrase or a metaphor is then adapted as more information is given in the text, sometimes expanding their reference, sometimes narrowing their reference down. So what I'd like to do at this point is turn to the two questions at the beginning of the paper and take them in reverse order. And I think we're now in a position to address the second. How does an interpreter interpret the biblical text in the context of other texts that are alluded to? And before giving an example of this, I think it would be helpful to note 4 ways that relevance theory can give some hermeneutical assistance to the interpreter of an ancient text. Firstly, because readers aim for optimal relevance, they stop searching for relevance when the expectations of optimal relevance are fulfilled, no matter how many other contexts might be available for them to explore. This means that when faced with an allusion to another text or a quotation, they will not necessarily probe the further context of that other text for further implicatures. On some occasions, they will expend that extra effort to investigate that context of the text, but there will usually be signals in the text that they are reading to suggest that optimal relevance demands that they expend extra effort to do this. Modern scholars, when we probe into a text, artificially increase our expectations of relevance because we're approaching it from an academic perspective. And in doing so, we willingly expend extra effort to analyze the text because we anticipate that there are still more contextual effects to gain, and we're willing to expend that extra effort in order to achieve the artificially high level of relevance that we have set. Ancient readers may not have gone as far as we would. Secondly, modern readings also differ from ancient readings because of the different contexts and different encyclopedic information that we have compared to ancient readers. This cultural gap between modern and ancient readers is obviously well described, but what relevance theory adds is the importance of appreciating which contextual information was the most accessible to the ancient interpreter. For that's where relevance will have been found, and not in the other contextual information that was available to them. Because modern readers do not share this context, and often do not know what's the most accessible context for someone, the inferences that we achieve, that we make, are often different to the ancient audience. And if presented with an inference that the ancient audience would make, we often reject it because it seems counterintuitive to us on the principles of relevance theory. In other words, it doesn't interact with the most immediate context for us, so it seems counterintuitive, even if it would have interacted with the most available context for the ancient readers. Thirdly, it's important to notice that the process of interpretation is dynamic and subconscious. Readers search in the most available context according to the principles of relevance, and if no relevance is found there, the search continues in the next most available context until relevance is found, or until the reader gives up, which does sometimes happen, as I think we can all attest. However, this context might be something that is made available by the encyclopedic information already accessed with the first context, and not something that was in the mind when the reader first approached the text. In other words, looking at something and beginning the automatic subconscious process of analyzing it, the first context that is accessed will have a certain bit of information gathering around it. And if relevance isn't immediately found in there, instead of proceeding in what would seem to be the most logical, linear fashion of saying what's the next context that they might access, what's the next text that they might think of, it may well be that there was something within this grab bag, this collection of information associated with the first text that actually forms a quicker route, some particular motif that's associated with that would take them off on a tangent to a different direction, and that's where they would find relevance, not in the linear pathway that we would lay out to begin with. And in addition, ad hoc concepts mean that the detail associated with anything within the text is constantly able to be changed, manipulated, morphed by the writer as they continue to explore things within the text. Fourth thing to note is communication is efficient, meaning that writers only use words that are necessary in communication. Extra words increase the processing effort required of the reader, and thereby decrease relevance, or sometimes lead to extra implicatures. A helpful example that Margaret Sim gives in an introductory book to relevance theory is talking about how you would phrase how you would answer a question like, would you like a coffee? And the answer is often no, or no thanks, which is a simple reply. To reply something with more words like, no thank you, I wouldn't like a cup of coffee at this moment, is not the usual way to reply and demands more processing effort of the hearer, and usually leads to certain unforeseen implicatures like, you think I'm stupid, don't you, for replying in such a way. We tend to reply with a minimum number of words that we can. Extra words increase the processing effort required of the reader, thereby decrease relevance or lead to further implicatures. However, extra words do need to be used where the shorter formulation could lead to ambiguity or a wrong reference. Further information can guide the reader towards the required interpretive context and away from a context that would lead to them to infer incorrectly. For example, in the middle of a conversation about a forthcoming conference, the question, how's the paper, would be an appropriate way of inquiring about the paper that someone is writing for the conference. If, however, you had been talking about the conference to the same person, but that person was at that moment reading a newspaper, then how's the paper would lead to a reply about the news. A fuller question, how's that paper of yours for July's conference coming along, would be more appropriate in those circumstances. The same thing applies in texts, and clear signals are given to a reader only where necessary. If a writer has cause to doubt that certain interpretive context is the closest for a reader, then the writer needs to give more information to direct the reader to that context. And this principle can be useful exegetically. Justin Fantin has used it a couple of years ago in a monograph on the title Kurios as applied to Jesus rather than against Caesar, and noting the places where extra language is used to make sure that the reference is used in a polemical fashion rather than a non-polemical fashion, which has actually added something to the argument in that sphere. So what I'd like to do is quickly apply it to one text. It'll obviously have to be very, very fast, but the text I'd like to apply it to is to Acts 17 and Paul's speech before the Areopagus. And the benefits of relevance theory in assessing the meaning of the New Testament text in its textual context can be illustrated by briefly examining Acts 17, a Lucan text that has the added interest of involving two competing textual contexts. The Lucan Paul is in Athens, the philosophical capital of the ancient world, and in Acts 17:28 he quotes both Aratus, explicitly introducing it with the formula, even as some of your own poets have said, And he alludes to someone else with the formula en auto gar zumen kai kinomen I asmen. In him we live, move, and have our being. This letter reference may well come from Epimenides, and that's who many people cite it to, but it's by no means certain, and it could have come from any one of a number of other Greek thinkers. Readers wouldn't necessarily need to identify which thinker spoke it, and to do so would require much processing effort. So it's actually quite likely that relevance would be found in the idea that it's the sort of things that Greek philosophers or poets say. Other parts of the speech also echo Stoic and Epicurean philosophers such as Pythagoras, Plato, Epictetus, and Zeno. And a well-read reader with a decent mental library would probably spot these readings and probably spot these allusions. In this way, Paul is seen to echo the thought of Greek thinkers without the reader focusing on any particular person, creating the implicature that Paul is engaging with Greek philosophy. But when it comes to references to the Old Testament, the speech doesn't have the explicit quotations to the Old Testament that Paul's speech in, for example, Acts chapter 13 does. There are allusions to the Old Testament in the speech, and Nestle Alan 28, with its usual characteristic enthusiasm, notes, I think, about 30 allusions to the Septuagint. There is not the space here, obviously, to develop and to detail which texts are alluded to. I've given you two particular texts with some breakdown as to how I think they can echo across. I'm not going to pick those apart. They're just there for information. But relevance theory can play a significant role in identifying which texts a reader would notice. For the purposes of this paper, it's enough to note that Paul seems to allude to Isaiah 42, verse 5 in Acts 17, 24 to 25, to the Genesis creation account in Acts 17:26, where he talks about the origins of humanity, to the Septuagint anti-idol polemic in 1729. In each case, a good case can be made for a reader making the connection because they are well-known texts in the Christian community. It's interesting to note that there are strong verbal similarities between Acts 17:24 and Acts 7:48, which I've put onto the handout there. But the significance of this may not be immediately apparent to the reader, who will be forced to expend extra processing effort to identify the links between Paul's discussion of worship and Stephen's. And I think it would be likely that as the reader moves from the encyclopedic information associated with Acts 7:48, this is an example of the change in trajectory. That the reader will become aware, as they're thinking of Acts 7:48, of the immediate quotation that follows in Acts 7:49 to Isaiah 66, verse 1, dealing with worship, and that's where the attention may be found, bringing an echo back into this text in Acts 17. So the reader is therefore faced with a Greek context for the speech and an Old Testament context for the speech, and therein lies one of the scholarly questions associated with this text. How is the reader supposed to interpret the text in the light of these two apparently conflicting contexts? It's been an area of scholarly contention for some time, with three broad approaches. Some, such as Bertil Gardner and David Powell, regard it as an attack on pagan idolatry based on Jewish anti-idolatry polemic. The majority, Martin de Villiers, Joe Fitzmyer, and Luke Timothy Johnson, among others, although many commentators take this line, think that the philosophers have a key role here. Thirdly, Kevin Rowe thinks that it's used in the light of both sets of texts simultaneously. And I think Rowe wins the day on this. As the speech is read in its narrative context, both contexts play a role, and relevance theory can illustrate why. The reader begins to read the account on two levels. Readers often do this when engaging with a narrative. On the level of the story, they look for the relevance that the characters in the story would deduce. But they also read it at the level of the reader themselves and see what is the relevance of the story for them. Although Paul is described as spermologos in Acts 17:18, the reader of Luke Acts would not take this to show that Paul is a babbler, because Luke has not presented Paul in this way so far. The contextual information available to the reader about Paul is that which Luke has given in the discourse so far. Paul is a skilled orator for Luke. So I think the reader of the text would not interpret this to say that that is what Paul is, but that is rather how the Athenians saw Paul. But they would continue to expect, as readers of this text, that Paul would show his debating skills later on when he comes before them in Athens. So while the reader will notice the sayings of the Greek writers, they are likely to pay more attention to the biblical allusions because they are a more accessible context for them for interpretation. It is well-known texts that are alluded to from the Septuagint, and readers will expect to find biblical allusions in Acts chapter 17 because they've been available and present and dominant in all of the speeches in Acts up until this moment. So they are an immediate context for interpretation and for making sense of the speech. Because of this, the biblical text would be easily available to them for the interpretation of Paul's world. But the biblical allusions themselves are subtle, and this is important to note. And this subtlety allows the Greek philosopher quotations some room for attention. If the biblical allusions were stronger, then I suspect that the reader would ignore the Greek language, fundamentally in terms of how the speech is constructed and its argument, and find relevance almost exclusively in something drawn from the biblical argument itself. So I think the reader would continue to read the text on two levels, as Paul's hearers would have read the text in Athens, with no biblical knowledge, hearing an engagement with the Greek philosophy and interpreting it in that light, and as Christian readers, reading the whole story with an alertness to biblical quotations which provide the interpretive grid for understanding Paul's argument in his critique of the Athenians and detailing an anti-idol polemic. Many of the advantages of relevance theory become apparent as it is used to illuminate the interpretive process. The repeated elusive reference to the Old Testament requires a little more processing effort of the reader than a clear allusion to Isaiah's anti-idol polemic, and this signals that further contextual effects are available in terms of implicature, and the reader will search for them and make them. The references to the philosophers are best understood as representations of their thought, signaling Paul's attitude towards them. There seems to be some approval, even as some of your prophets have said, Paul says. But Paul is far more at home arguing from Scripture, and the Scripture forms the matrix of his thought here. Ad hoc concepts are also important, as the relationship of the humans to the divine is developed with reference to different texts, both from the Old Testament and from Greek thinkers. And the detail of the interpretive moves made by the reader would depend on the availability of certain interpretive context and then encyclopedic information for the reader. In the remaining part of the paper, I want to move on to the first question and make some tentative suggestions about that too from Relevance. Finally, the question of literacy among the readers of the New Testament documents can be addressed by taking it from the angle of how much literacy did the authors of the New Testament documents expect their readers to have. And for this purpose, relevance theory should be helpful. Admittedly, this is a huge undertaking. Even restricting the discussion here to the writings of Luke and to Luke's own particular expectation, there's only space for the briefest of sketches and some tentative conclusions. From a relevance perspective, it can best be addressed in the following way. Bearing in mind the principle of underdeterminacy, you say as little as you need to, is there evidence that Luke assumes biblical literacy in his readers and thereby writes without having to direct his readers to the biblical text explicitly? Or is Luke required to signpost references to the Old Testament more clearly because the readers were not familiar enough with it? We will look at this through 4 different types of scripture use in Luke. Firstly, quotations. In many quotations and in some allusions, Luke seems to signpost the references to the Old Testament clearly, quoting or detailing enough information for the reader to understand his point. In these cases, the reader really does need to know the biblical text to understand what Luke is saying, and therefore Luke gives it. Examples of this include David's use of Lord in Luke 20, 42 to 44. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Luke and Jesus repeats that quotation in its entirety so that the reader has it available before them, and they do not need to know the text because it is given. The detail from the Psalms in Acts chapter 2, verses 25 to 31, Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost when he refers to how David spoke about the resurrection of the Messiah, quotes the text, and then goes back and unpicks the text referring back to the text that he's just quoted to explain why it applies. The reader doesn't seem to need to know the Old Testament text because it's given for the reader. The quotation of Isaiah in Acts 7:49 to 50, the one I mentioned in Stephen's speech, again is given in its fullness. And the quotation from the suffering servant and its explanation in Acts chapter 3, verses 30 to 34. Again, we have the Ethiopian eunuch. We're told that he's reading from the scroll of Isaiah. And we're then told the words that he is reading, or at least a verse of it is given to us. And Philip then asks him if he understands that text. But it's given for the reader, so the reader doesn't need to know the whole text. And in terms of an allusion, we could perhaps turn to Luke chapter 4 and the sermon in the synagogue in Nazareth, where after quoting from Isaiah 61, Jesus talks about the widow of Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian, but gives all of the essential details from the story for the reader to understand what Jesus is going on to say. The reader does not need to provide anything. Luke has expended extra effort to give all the information that the reader needs. But this does not require that Luke thinks his reader does not know these texts, I propose. I think there are other good reasons for Luke to be quoting them in these situations. The formal quotation is important for his story as a representation of the Old Testament words so that they can be used as part of his argument. In fact, there's a suggestion that Luke may be assuming the readers are aware of the further context to some of these quotations. For example, the quotation in Acts chapter 8 of the suffering servant almost requires the reader to be aware of the further context of the quotation in order to understand the detail of the discussion that would have gone on between Philip and the eunuch. And this is not signaled, suggesting that Luke, anticipating his readers, knew the surrounding text in Isaiah and what that was to do with. In other cases, quotations are introduced without a quote introduction, and the reader is required to know the surrounding context of these quotations in order to make sense of the text. For example, the quotations from the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah on the lips of Jesus as he performs the temple action. Without knowing the context of the text in Isaiah, without knowing the context of the text in Jeremiah, it's difficult to make sense of exactly what Jesus' critique is in the temple. So in those situations, I propose that Luke is assuming that his readers are aware of the meaning of these texts and the context of these texts, because he doesn't signal further information. Secondly, in many places, Luke uses allusions or echoes to the Old Testament. In Acts 17, as we've just discussed, there are two competing contexts against which the text can be understood: Greek philosophical schools and the Old Testament. The text can be read on two levels, and Luke assumes that his readers are capable of both. His narrative requires that they see the biblical structure in the Luke and Paul's argument from the beginning of the discourse, and this is not signaled for the reader, unlike the Greek texts, which are clearly signaled. He could have drawn more attention to the Old Testament texts, and he could have provided an explicit reference back to Deuteronomy Isaiah at the climax of the speech, perhaps through a quotation of Isaiah, perhaps through explicit reference to his anti-idol polemic, or through some explicit commentary that points the reader to Isaiah. But he doesn't do any of those things, and it seems essential to the understanding of the speech. It's assumed that the reader is aware enough of Isaiah to get the references and to make sense of the argument. What is more, the reader is not simply expected to see a general reference to Isaiah, but to make connection with certain specific aspects of Isaiah's argument and specific Isaianic texts. Something similar happens, I propose, in the story of Israel in Acts chapter 7, as Stephen recounts it there. The Lucan Stephen's use of scripture is highly selective. He tells only certain strands through the story of Israel. And Luke seems to anticipate his readers are aware not only of the texts that Stephen is using and the story that Stephen is using, but the surrounding texts in order to spot how selective this particular reading of the story is. And they need to do that to spot the emphasis of Stephen's speech and the emphasis of Luke's narrative. Thirdly, There are some general references to Scripture in Luke. And in each case, Luke seems to be assuming that his readers know the sort of things that Luke is referring to in the Old Testament. Otherwise, he would have needed to be more specific. Perhaps the strongest of these, I think, is in Luke 21:22, where there's a reference for these are the days of vengeance as a fulfillment of all that is written. Jesus is speaking in his third saying about the destruction of Jerusalem and talking about the days of vengeance that are coming upon Jerusalem. And makes a reference to a fulfillment of all that is written. While to some extent, I think this saying is simply an expansion of the allusions to the Old Testament that are a little bit clearer in the surrounding verses, implying the days of vengeance need to be understood against the general Old Testament background, not simply one from the verses alluded to. It does assume that the readers are aware of the sort of scriptures that have this as their content in order to make sense of what Jesus is saying. In a similar vein, the references of the risen Jesus to the fulfillment of scriptures in him, Luke 24:27 and 44-45, seem to assume that the readers are aware of at least the kind of texts that are under discussion, even if they may not name particular ones. While Luke is probably just making the point that Jesus fulfills Scripture without meaning the reader to think of any specific text, and certainly as Luke goes into the book of Acts, he then unpacks the sort of text that he's thinking about so that the reader finally realizes the precise texts that are being talked about. So while Luke is probably making the general point that Jesus fulfills Scripture without meaning the reader to think of any specific text, the extra words that Luke selects, all the prophets, in the law of Moses, the prophets and the Psalms, points to a more specific reference without specifically identifying text, suggesting that he expected his readers to know the sort of text he was thinking of. Fourthly, in places Luke's narrative has a structure such that it follows the pattern and motifs of certain Old Testament texts, whether this is the echo of the Isaianic New Exodus in Acts, as David Powell suggests, the use of certain psalms in the speeches in Acts and in the Passion Discourse of Luke to say something about Jesus, as Peter Doble contends, or the way that Jesus' entry into Jerusalem in Luke 19 plays out Zechariah 9, verse 9. Zechariah 9, verse 9 is quoted in Matthew's account, it's quoted in John's account. It isn't quoted in Luke's account, nor in Mark's account. But what stands out about Luke's account is it seems to be, in Joel Green's words, an enacted version, an enacted allusion to the text. What happens is playing out the sort of stuff that's talked about in Zechariah 9, verse 9. So Zechariah 9, verse 9 seems to be a text lying behind this that the reader's expected to understand and to spot the allusion. But it's subtle enough that only the reader with textual knowledge will find it. And Luke seems to assume that the reader has that textual knowledge. In each case, the reader's understanding of the text is far greater when the allusion is noted. And in each case, Luke does not expend extra words trying to signal the presence of the allusion. All of this suggests that Luke anticipated his readers were familiar with the Old Testament and that the Old Testament stories and texts were available to them. They at least had a high degree of textuality. In the words of Chris Keith, they had knowledge, usage, and appreciation of text regardless of individual or majority ability to create or access them via literate skills. So clearly, this does not require that they were literate. And in practice, I don't think this is a simple differentiation to make at the level of the New Testament text. But the textual competency of the audience is important to note. While it's probably fairer to say that Luke anticipated a certain level of textuality in his community as a whole rather than individuals, because it was read and probably explained in groups, I think it's also fair to say that too much would be lost for any individual hearer if they didn't have a certain degree of textuality themselves. Such textual competency can, presumably, exist in the absence of literacy in oral cultures. Members of the church may attain sufficient knowledge of popular texts in the Christian community and from the synagogue. So Luke may be relying on such social memory of Old Testament texts. And in that case, literacy and textuality could perhaps be differentiated through the degree of specific detail that is required of the audience. So in conclusion, Relevance theory, I think, is a helpful theory of human cognition and communication that can be helpfully applied to biblical studies to highlight certain aspects of the interpretation of text. In particular, I think it's helpful showing how readers of the New Testament engage with other textual contexts, showing how their attention is drawn to the most available context, and highlighting how scholars can approach the text across a cultural gap. But I think it also has a potential role in demonstrating that biblical writers expected a textual competency in their readers. More work is certainly required to demonstrate this literacy, and I'd value any comments that people may have that would help to point to what would be a difference between literacy and textuality, as I've defined them, from the audience, from Luke's perspective. Thank you.